I guess, to be fair, a brownfield landscape is it's an incredibly general term. I mean, brownfield is, I was associated with an abandoned, and a site that's been occupied or used by us in some way. It may well be an industrial site, or it could well be an old quarry. They're basically where we've just gone in, done some stuff, and then left it alone. And I think what makes it so good is the variety, isn't it? Our process of building stuff falling down, going into disrepair, we're leaving piles of rubble, all these processes in fact, the man-made sort of processes once you leave it alone, create an incredibly diverse plant communities and topography and soil types and structures. So, and that is what creates diverse wildlife, as we kind of all know.
So it's quite interesting as well. So you talk about mentioning there about topography and how, if you're altering the topography, both building up and recessing the ground, how just that small sort of nuance in topography, how that can specifically can have a massive effect on, again, flora and fauna as well.
Yeah, because what all the topography is doing is it's giving you, if essentially, if you've got a landscape that you put the same soil everywhere and you rake it flat, you're going to, basically, the vegetation is going to want to be the same throughout the whole of that landscape, isn't it? It's going to want to default to that. Now, you can garden it and try and stop it from doing that, which is what gardening is, in effect, isn't it? I mean, we put topsoil everywhere, and then we try and grow plants that couldn't compete against the plants that like topsoil. So gardening is a process of stopping succession, really. But if you can start to dictate the soils and the topography, then you can actually say, right, I want this part of my landscape to be relatively low vegetation. I want it to be relatively sparse. And I know the plants that really like that sort of habitat, and I'm going to give them the soil and the aspect that they like. And therefore, I don't have to garden it quite so much, do I? Because it's actually wanting to be that thing. Whereas if you are kind of stuck with fertile topsoil, you're always going to be fighting against what it wants to be, which in effect is going to be coarse grass and competitive weeds, and then bramble, and then scrub, and then trees. So by altering the substrates and choosing your substrates, you're kind of working with the plants, and you're giving the plants what they want. And I think it's a bit like the Chateau thing, right plant, right place. And I think we need to think about right soil, right plant. I mean, it needs to, and the opportunities then for to design with that. So you can then dictate what your plants do. You can dictate what your plants do, what plants are going to be happy there. And you can also dictate where plants aren't going to be happy and where they're not going to grow. So therefore, you can dictate your spaces in the landscape. And it's often the space between plants, isn't it, that makes the landscape really work. And then once we started, I mean, this all came off the back of we built a big 3-car garage for a customer, and we planched it up, and we went back after a few years, like we often do, to see how things were going. And she'd had a granite fines driveway leading up to this garage that butted to the garage. And when we came back to see, she wasn't a gardener at all, but all the green roof plants that were on the roof had all seeded down off the roof into the granite driveway. And this was the most amazing landscape. And that was a kind of another slightly light bulb moment when I thought, well, hang on, the driveway is way more interesting than the flower borders. And you know what I mean? And as soon as, and it was that kind of flip on your head, the paths were more interesting than the borders. And also they were not only more interesting, but she hadn't done anything to them either. She hadn't gardened them. So the maintenance obviously was reduced as well. So that was the kind of key thing. And then once you start dabbling around in what materials you can grow plants in, it's endless. I mean, we must have about 15 different materials here, including nearly every sort of construction waste material, and loads of local sands and building sands and lots of other crushed waste materials. So and once you start putting that down and seeing what grows, and it's really fascinating. And that's only from a plant perspective. I mean, once you start opening the topography up to looking at insect habitat and breeding space for invertebrates, then of course you can then dictate what invertebrates you'd like to bring in. You know, what sand of what solitary bees like, for instance. You know, and then we're finding out now what particular sands what particular bees like, and what sort of rubble size, for instance. We're just finding we're getting bumblebee nesting in large pieces of rubble now. So if we pile big piles of rubble, if they're big pieces of rubble, well, there's loads of voids in there, and the bumblebees are starting to nest in there now. So that I mean, you know, amazing. And pure crushed brick and concrete, for instance, you can create shingle in effect. So we've got like an urban dungeon-esque going on. Because the plants don't care. The plants don't seem to care whether it's a beach pebble or whether it's a smashed up piece of concrete and brick. You know what I mean? So there's all those kind of possibilities.